Hello, everyone. My name is Father John Burns. I'm a priest to the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, and I just would like to share a few reflections with you on a situation, let's call it an opportunity in the church, that I really think if we pour some energy and attention into, we'll see some dramatic change and renewal within the church. What I've been praying with lately, especially, is the diminishment of the presence of one particular part of the body or the system that used to be there and is not there in the way that it was. And that part, or that presence, is that of the religious woman. I want to tell a story from nature and then show how it applies to the church supernaturally. And the story is about the wolves in Yellowstone. You may know some of that story. It's back in the early 1900s that people around the park decided to get rid of the wolves in Yellowstone, and by the mid-20s, there were no wolves left in the park. In the absence of the wolves, the park shifted around the loss of what's called an apex predator, someone at the sort of top of the food chain. And as the park shifted, the behavior of the animals and thus also the topographical reality of the park and the plants and the trees adjusted, principally because of the elk. The elk no longer had their main predator, and so they're able to graze wherever they wished, and they took over the floodplains along the river. And as they did that, they grazed the plains to the ground. And for decades, this was just the reality of Yellowstone National Park, until in the mid-1990s, there was a group of conservationists who decided, maybe something is missing that's always been here, and it's the wolves. And there was a lot of opposition, a lot of back and forth legislative battles, but eventually the wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park. And as they were, everything adjusted around their return. It's a crazy thing to ponder. What happened was they began to hunt the elk out on these floodplains, which very quickly changed the behavior of the elk. They moved into the uplands or out into the forests and away from the rivers. And so the floodplains that had been grazed for decades to the ground began to regenerate, and wildflowers sprung up, which brought back new populations of songbirds and rodents, which also brought back more foxes and coyotes. But additionally, beyond just the flowers, what sprung up were these aspens and these willows, which had been grazed to the ground because the wood is very soft. And as these trees sprang up, new forests along the rivers developed. And as the trees grew, they developed deep root systems that fortified riverbanks that were previously very susceptible to erosion each season as the rivers would crest. So in that, the riverbeds became fortified. And as this happened, and trees were growing along the banks, the beaver population, which was almost completely down to zero, began to come back as well. They found food and resources right along the riverbanks with which to build new beaver dams. And so the combination of the beaver dams and the fortified riverbanks actually adjusted some of the subaquatic ecosystems and, many argue, the flow and course of the rivers. All because the wolves were reintroduced back into the food chain and into the ecosystem of Yellowstone National Park. It's called a trophic cascade, if you like systems theory and ecosystems. It's worth taking a look at, and it's a very beautiful witness to the importance of how systems fit together in nature, and then by extension, what that can tell us about how systems fit together supernaturally. So to apply that to the church, we know from Scripture, divine revelation, that the church is also a system. It's a body composed of many parts. And what I've been praying with lately is just noticing in the world and the way that we struggle with so much in the church, not just because of the culture, but this certain sense that something's missing, we're not well. And we keep trying different programs and initiatives and efforts to renew, and so many of these things have worked really beautifully and well. But I think there's one area that we're not looking at that has caused a tremendous shifting that looks a little bit like that shifting in Yellowstone National Park. And the area that I want to point to is the presence of the consecrated religious woman. That since the beginning of the church, there have been women who gave their entire lives to Jesus. And since the beginning of the church in America, there have been sisters. And sisters traditionally ran our schools, helped establish and administrate our hospitals, and in many of our parishes undertook the catechetical work and the support work that complemented the work of the priests. They just were a part of the system, if you will, of the church. And in the 80s and 90s, we saw a steep decline in vocations to consecrated religious life, of women in particular. What I don't think we've ever really accounted for is how we were impacted by the change, or by the fact that many of these communities had to withdraw from their active engagement in these apostolates in our schools, in our healthcare systems, and in our parishes. As the sisters withdrew, we needed to make an adjustment. And the adjustment was pretty simple. We just began to hire lay staffs to replace the religious staffs. And that's a good idea that coheres with the principles of Vatican II, and it's worked in many ways. But what we haven't really accounted for is how that changed the structure of the church and even the operations of the church, first financially and pragmatically. To bring on a lay staff is a very different effect on just the budgets and the way we do our stewardship. Previously, the religious were supported by their communities by and large, and some support from the parish, but they weren't often hired and sustained by the parish itself. Whereas a lay person, when they take a job in the parish, of course, we have to pay them a full salary, as well as benefits if they need them, which is a different bottom line item. And in many of our budgets today, if we have schools in our parishes, a significant bulk of the budget is personnel. A bulk or a number that didn't used to be there. And of course that shifted the way we need to do our stewardship and be concerned for enrollment and numbers and membership, all because each of these things drives the income that allows us to be able to pay our staffs. And so granted, that's just like kind of one metric, right? Structurally, we've had to adjust the way we think about apostolates in schools when the sisters kind of left behind some of the things they were doing so beautifully for the church and for the parish. But in addition to these changes, I just want to really name the fact that there's something much deeper, like the pragmatic and the financial, institutional, structural things. We could talk about those all day, and there's some interesting things there. But the bigger change, the bigger absence, the bigger shift, I argue, is a metaphysical one, or one felt at the level of ontology. Precisely because the church is right when the church says that religious life is a more perfect cleaving to Christ. It's a taking of the evangelical counsels by vow to live for heaven. And so it witnesses eloquently to the whole church and the whole world who Jesus is and what it is to live for Jesus. We're all called to live the counsels. We're all called to live holiness. We're all called to witness to Jesus. The consecrated religious, and specifically the consecrated religious woman, has a particular witness that the whole church needs. Let me explain. Let's do a little bit of Ephesians 5. When you look at the way that Paul is teaching about marriage, he explains that man and woman should sort of understand each other the way that Christ and the church are related. And he goes back and forth talking about the need for the man to love his wife the way that Christ loved the church, the way the woman should receive that love and respond to it the way the church receives the love of Christ and responds to it. And when he's going back and forth trying to explain this, he kind of eventually sort of gives up. He says, in the end, what I'm talking about is a great mystery, and I mean it in reference to Christ and the church. That right there is actually a very beautiful indicator of how we should understand marriage. That we have to recognize that marriage, human marriage, sacramentally blessed in particular, is an icon into something ultimate. And the ultimate is the marriage of Christ and the church. We see that in the book of Revelation. We actually know by revelation that there's really only one marriage that lasts into eternity. When Jesus is asked in Matthew's gospel about marriage and this woman who's lost all these husbands and who's she going to be married to when they get to heaven, he says, well, in heaven, they'll be like the angels. They won't be giving in marriage and taking in marriage. They won't be marrying. They'll be like the angels. The earthly institution, as it were, sacramentally structured, is to bring us to heaven. But as we enter into heaven, we enter into the final union, which is that of Christ and the church, the ultimate, if you will, dyad, the divine bridegroom and the divine bride, which together represents the apex and the fullness of all creation. Now, that's all basic ecclesiology. But to look at the system, I want to point out the value of the eschatological sign that is the celibate. The man or woman called to celibacy foregoes the draw of the natural inclinations to natural marriage, to the rearing of offspring, and all these beautiful things that are related to marriage. We pass over that to respond directly to and to participate directly in what's happening in heaven. And now the priest is an easier place to trace this out, because we see priests a lot and we understand what's going on there theologically. The priest is called to be, some say, an alter Christus, another Christ. He stands in persona Christi, in the person of Christ, and speaks for Christ and extends Christ's saving works by instrumentally and sacramentally making Christ present again, by celebrating the sacraments, by preaching, by teaching. The priest, though, being an alter Christus, is called to sort of be a face for Christ to the church. That when we look at our priests, we should see something of Christ there. And that should inspire us to understand he who laid down his life for us as church. And that should give us an insight into the goodness of God who loves us deeply. Now, of course, priests are imperfect, and we do this with flaw in many, many ways. But that's the high calling. The priest is meant to witness to the ultimate reality of being espoused to the church forever, and to show something of what Christ is like here on earth as he's attempting to perfect that bond over and over again in every age. The conundrum, if you will, or the dilemma is that the priest can only offer, as it were, half of that ultimate dyadic witness. The priest witnesses conformed to Christ as a man, participating in and configured to the heart of Jesus Christ, divine bridegroom. We can theologize and teach about and speak about the other half of that ultimate story. And we witness to it by our baptism, of course. But by consecration, ordination, we witness to the ultimate dyad, to the final union of Christ and the church, only partially. The other half of that story, if you will, is testified to by the woman, because the church is the bride. And there is an ultimate way here in time of being conformed to the woman, the church, the bride, that is meant to bring down complementarily but distinctly the ultimate reality so the whole world can understand. And that's the consecrated religious woman. She does, in complement to the priest, the same thing of witnessing to ultimacy, but only here and now in a personalized fashion that's meant to awaken all of us to an awareness of who we are and where we're going. See, it all supposed to fit together. Marriage needs to try and figure out what it's like to live this ultimate union, which is a great mystery. And so marriage looks to the priest to be like, well, how does a man supernaturally conformed to Christ serve the church, his bride? And that ought to inform the way the man thinks something about how he could and should serve his bride. And the bride can look to the man and be like, well, how does that love poured out for the church show me something about my husband's love and how my husband's love is supposed to be like Christ's? And how could I receive that as the bride and respond to it? That looking at holy priests, marriage benefits learning something about Christ, the divine bridegroom. But they also need to be able to look at holy religious women to understand the other half of this ultimate story that they're trying to be an icon for here and now. From the priest's perspective, we need to be able to look at holy marriages to understand what we're called to ultimately and what we're supposed to be testifying to sacramentally. But we also need to be able to look at holy religious women because they show us something about who we are. They awaken something in the priest's heart that's different than holy marriage awakens. Because we, as priests, are conformed to Christ's divine bridegroom, trying to lay it on our lives for the bride, the church, that she would live. Well, that's a great mystery. I look at the parish and I don't really know how to understand my nuptial relation to this group of people of all ages, shapes, and forms. It's a mystery. But when I see the religious woman, I start to understand it a little bit. When the priest sees the religious woman, he's seeing something of a face for that ultimate bride. And the way he's able to strive to be holy, to serve her, to bless her, he starts to understand something about his own heart as conformed to Christ. Now, of course, she's not his bride. The church is his bride in the heart of Jesus Christ. But she puts a face to the church. She puts a face to the Blessed Virgin Mary. She puts a face to the ultimate feminine part of this beautiful heavenly reality. And when that's missing, priests are confused about who they are and who they're for. Marriage is actually also confused about who the priest is and who he's for. And everybody is sort of looking around trying to figure out this great mystery without half of the help that we were intended to have. Additionally, as a friend has written in a recent essay, when the priest doesn't have the complement often present in the parish, he stumbles into feeling like a single parent, trying to run a home and trying to administrate and figure everything out, all on his desk, on his heart, on his mind. Something is awakened in the heart of the priest, as in the heart of the layperson, when they see the face, the heart of Mary, the face, the heart of the bride. And you see this just anecdotally whenever you go out in public and you do come across a religious woman in her habit. Everybody kind of turns and looks, or you notice that people are attending to this woman in a different way than they're attending to anyone else, even than the priest, if there's a priest there. If you go out in public places, conferences, or events where religious are often present, you'll see crowds gathering of men and women around the sisters. They want to be around them, they want to talk to them. Because, I argue, the presence of the religious woman is awakening in all the hearts that she encounters a deep awareness of our own identity as members of the church and a deep sense of where we're supposed to go, how the church is supposed to be perfected in spousal love of Jesus Christ. The religious woman awakens and reminds the whole church, every believer, of who they are and where they're going. And so to carry the images together, when you take out something so essential as religious life, or when the visible, dynamic, and apostolic presence no longer has the role that it used to, the whole system has to adjust, which we did. And in the adjustment, we just sort of forgot that things used to be different. Like the park, if you will, kind of forgot how it used to be. The restoration, the renewal, the replenishment, the flourishing of women's religious life actually would rebalance the whole thing, restore the eschatological witness to the ultimate dyad, refresh marriage, renew the priesthood, and would be a blessing upon those women called. It's a type of restoration that isn't really programmatic, is institutionally ordered actually by theology rather than strategy. But I think at this point in the game, we all have to admit that like something is wrong, and we know something's wrong, but we don't quite know how to name it. And there are lots of things wrong and lots of things we do need to focus on. But this one requires a certain attention, precisely because the passage of time has caused an adjustment in the church as to how we do things. And sometimes I fear we've forgotten that we need to be attentive to the reality that Christ is still calling. First time I went to a Steubenville Youth Conference, I remember at the end of the conference on the last day's mass, there's this vocations call. And after this beautiful weekend, the young men and women are invited to consider giving their lives to Christ formally by consecration. And then the priest invites up any women and any men who are open to the possibility of a celibate vocation to receive a blessing from the bishop. At this particular conference, a beautiful response from the men, but then the women were called forward. And the stunning response kind of floored everybody, priests and organizers alike. It was 1/3 of the girls in attendance who came forward, that was some 300 women, to say, I'm open to the possibility of a religious vocation in front of my friends, in front of the guys, in front of my teachers and my parents. It was a crazy, beautiful witness. But what was shocking about it is that as the bishop was giving his blessing, I remember looking around the entire arena, and there was not a single consecrated religious woman in the house to point them to say, hey, this is what it could look like, or this is someone to talk to, or this is just a witness to what maybe Jesus is doing in your heart. There was nowhere to point them. And I remember being righteously upset that as these girls go home, they're all going to say, well, something happened there. It was powerful. No one asked me about it again. I didn't know what to do about it, so I did nothing about it. And that unexamined question, they often will carry with themselves for decades. I took it to my archbishop. We had a beautiful conversation. I said, I think we've forgotten that for decades, we took care of the men discerning priesthood, and the religious women took care of the women. For decades, we just presumed that someone could be taking care of that because they always did. But as the sisters, in declining numbers, had to withdraw from many of these apostolates of presence, they no longer were able to take care of the young women who would be discerning the same way that we'd been taking care of the men. And for, I would say, maybe decades in some places, we have not had someone with an eye on this dilemma. I brought this to our auxiliary bishop, and he said, you know what? We should have been talking about this at least a decade ago. We fell asleep at the wheel here. And that's kind of my fear, is that maybe a lot of us just forgot that someone's not necessarily taking care of these women the way that we're taking care of the men. Now, we've got this other dynamic that's going on, which is also exciting and challenging. When you talk to these religious communities of women that are flourishing, and there are a good number of them around the country, plenty of young women entering these communities, but they have a real problem, and that's a problem of demand. They are asked by bishops, by parishes, by pastors all around the country to send sisters to establish a presence again where the sisters used to be, because everybody knows, I miss the sisters, let's get the sisters back. Father, can we have sisters? So these priests and these bishops reach out, and they add their names to a long, long waiting list. Some of these communities have waiting lists of hundreds of dioceses, parishes, and schools asking for sisters. And the superiors just say, I can't send, I don't have sisters to send. Because sisters don't just grow on trees. It's a vocation. It has to be cultivated. It has to be discerned. Then there has to be all this formation that goes on, all these layers that look a little bit like diocesan seminary, but they're also quite different. They have their own texture and nuance, and it's very sacred, but requires a good deal of formation before these sisters are ready to send out into another diocese or parish to establish an apostolate. And so we're sitting in this conundrum here. We have a lot of religious communities greatly in need of vocations. And we have a lot of young women who say, I believe I'm called, but I don't know what to do about it. In between these two is where the whole church sits. In between these two is where we actually have all this opportunity to start thinking differently, strategically, programmatically, theologically, spiritually, and make some adjustments maybe to the way that we ponder how we could support these communities and how we could be attentive on the ground to what Jesus is actually saying in the hearts of some of these young women. After that conference, I went out and visited with one of the major superiors of a community that's doing really well. And she said, Father, for us, we need your help in ways that I'm not sure that you realize. We are structured charismatically. Like we're present wherever the charism is, and that's our apostolate and our apostolic presence. We can do our work in those places, and we can cultivate vocations there and receive the women we encounter. But we're only present where the charism is present. You, diocesan priests, are structured geographically. Wherever there's space, there's a parish, there's a diocese. You're everywhere, where only in a few places are our sisters. And that gap, if we could figure out how to bridge that gap, she said, would change the way that all of us look at the situations we're looking at. And that's kind of been haunting me ever since that conversation. It's like, what would it look like for us on the ground to start thinking about women's vocations differently? To recognize that in many of our dioceses, someone used to take care of this and they don't. In some of our dioceses, we have taken good attentiveness to this question and placed people in these areas. But it might just be one person assigned or a volunteer. Or before it was all of the sisters who were present in our diocese, talking about this in all of the classrooms, with all of the families, in the whole church. I mean, the shift there is tremendous, and it's no wonder that we've seen the impact, as it were, in vocational numbers. But I just remain convinced that this is not just an idea, and that conference wasn't a flash in the pan. Here's why. I was back at that same venue, but 4 years later, so the students had changed over, and I wasn't sure how it would go. I anticipated a strong response, like the last time. I didn't anticipate that even as the culture's changed more, and many of these parishes and communities have even less sisters than they did 4 years ago, that the response would increase. Where the first time 4 years ago, it was 300 girls who came forward. This time, it was 500 girls. It was half the women at the conference who were willing to say, I'm open to Jesus Christ and to a religious calling. I mean, our minds were blown. And it just reinforces this awareness that like something is happening right now. As the Lord awakens in the hearts of these young women who often have never seen a woman inhabit the possibility of a calling. And that falls to us to steward well the work of Jesus Christ in those hearts. Yes, the sisters have this competence and this set of duties, and it's their proper arena to cultivate these vocations. But how much we could be doing on the ground in our diocese to come alongside those communities and to assist them. It doesn't really require a whole shift of establishing a new office or launching a new initiative. But I would say if we're having synods, if we're having strategic conversations, if we're planning out for the future, we ought to be pondering this question. Like, what are we doing for the women? The way we're doing all these great things for the men. And on the ground, very practically, in many places, when a young woman does have this experience of a possible call stirring in her heart, what does she do? She might go online and look at a few websites for the communities that she's heard of or seen. But then she usually calls the vocations office because she thinks she has received a vocational calling. Well, the vocations office should deal with this calling with me. But as we know, in our vocations offices, most of us are assigned really just to work for the men and for priestly vocations because that's our competence, that's our duty. And so it can be a very discouraging answer for a young woman to hear like, hey, it's cool what's happening. Here's a book, but I really just work for the priests and I don't have the resources or the time to do anything else. And what a heartbreaking response, but unfortunately it comes from all of us because we have too much to do already. But what if we could just rethink that? What if every time we get that call or see that young woman or carry those set of questions, what if we could think about stewarding that vocation possibility? And walking with that toward these communities? What if we would see our role in the diocese, one of the many roles that we serve, as being a bridge to these religious communities who are full of life and who are just waiting for more women so that the Lord can have them formed and sent out? What if we're actually that middle term? And it probably wouldn't require a huge shift. You know, in some dioceses, there have been assignments shifted around this conundrum and this question. But if we all could think about it on the ground level, and bring this into our conversations and our planning and our discussions, and even in the vocations offices in particular, if we could put in a few hours a month maybe, just inviting parishes to have the language and the resources to encourage these things among the young women as they are among the young men. And if we, as vocation directors and vocations teams, could be thinking about how to receive those calls, how to invite those calls forth, how to nurture them and accompany them toward the next steps in discernment, if we could have those sets of questions and realities in mind, I'm convinced that we would be able to move toward a restoration of things as they ought to be. I simply refuse to believe that just as we hit, the 21st century, all of a sudden we're just not supposed to have religious women in the church, even though we've had them back to the beginning. I think we've just missed a couple of things that happened. And as we look back on them, we can say, okay, we maybe didn't handle that perfectly well. We may have misjudged a few things. We maybe just took our eyes off of one situation or two that we should have been paying attention to. But let's turn the wheel on that thing and let's get back to what we could be doing. It's not actually a lot of work. It's just a different mindset. It's not a new pragmatic mindset. It's a new theological mindset. And it's the acknowledgement, humbly, for all of us, that we're missing something. We're missing something that's supposed to be there. And it's not functional. It's actually theological. We're missing the witness to the bride. And she personifies and shows all of us with a face, with a heart, with a life, with an apostolate. She shows us who we are. And we're forgetting who we are. And what an opportunity to remember, in fidelity to that call of the prophets all through the Old Testament, who God is and who we are as his people, called into covenantal love to be fruitful for the nations. The opportunity before us is actually really exciting. It's simple, it's small, and it just begins by this sort of conversation, being willing to look at things differently, think about them differently, and pray about them differently. From there, the conversations that'll come out of these sets of ponderings, I hope we'd be able to develop some pretty cool ideas and some pretty cool initiatives around thinking differently, completely, about what it means to renew a church that is so much in need of renewal, and to welcome the grace of the Holy Spirit to finish what has begun so wonderfully in the hearts of many of these young men and women.